Hi everyone, and welcome to the Blame It on Marketing podcast. We've got a very special guest joining us today who we will introduce you to in just a second. And the topic of today's podcast is going to be toxic thought leadership. It's something that Ruta, Ian and I have all talked about extensively, and it's something we want to sort of really dig into. Ian, over to you to quickly introduce yourself to everyone.
Yeah, I'm Ian MacRae. I'm a work psychologist. I've written about 6 books now on workplace psychology, and one of my latest ones is perfect for the topic today. So it's Dark Social, understanding the dark side of work, personality, and social media, and how all of those work together. Because I'm really interested in digital communication in the workplace and social media, and how kind of all of our lives going online, our communication going online, our workplaces going online affects people's psychology and how that interacts. So I'm really excited to talk about toxic thought leadership.
It's awesome. I think I'll start by sort of maybe explaining what we mean by toxic thought leadership. So it's something, and Ruta and I, and Ian actually, we all work a lot with B2B brands, and it is something that organisations really try to strive for when it comes to their subject matter experts, which is to have in-house thought leaders who are kind of on social media, putting out best practice, sharing with the world everything that they think about everything, and beyond. And in some regards that's good, and in other places there is a sort of like more toxic side to that, and that is, you know, potentially where people are sharing maybe quite dangerous opinions on things, or they're not caveating things, or they're not using, especially in Ian's case, they're not talking about the science behind what it is they're actually discussing. And so that's what we wanted to talk about, which is the dangerous side of thought leadership. So Ian, I guess let's talk about this first. So when we talk about thought leaders, you know, what do we really mean by thought leaders? Where does that come from?
Yeah, I mean, traditionally, I would have thought a thought leader is someone who is actually changing opinions and making a significant difference on the public perception or public discussion and debate about any particular issue. Whereas now on social media, a thought leader tends to be anyone who posts their thoughts online, right, for a couple of likes. So it's kind of changed a lot over the last few years. So I think if we're talking about thought leaders, we should look at, are people making an impact, not just on social media, but outside of social media. I think the most effective thought leaders have made a huge impact in the wider world, or even in their local communities or in their workplaces. It doesn't have to be a huge global impact. It can be a really significant, important kind of local or community impact. So understanding what they're doing, how they're changing thoughts, ideas, perceptions, or actual actions versus how they're sharing them and explaining them on social media is an important distinction.
And just so you guys are kind of clued in, this is exactly why we got Ian on, because he's an actual, like, bona fide thought leader on things. He writes books, he studies things, he does the proper research. So this is why we wanted to talk to Ian about it, instead of, I guess, getting somebody that maybe posts on LinkedIn and has a big LinkedIn following, and that's how they got to their thought leader status, which isn't technically necessarily a thought leader status.
Yeah, I think actually that's a really good point, Ruta, because I actually think there's a clear distinction between a thought leader and an influencer, and maybe we can talk about that later. Because yeah, I think thought leader is definitely, as you say, Ian, and even traditionally, it's somebody who is a expert professional who is studied, is trained, has the qualifications to back up the things they're saying, I think, in the background. So maybe a clear distinction to make.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and especially if that's based on, evidence or a long history of doing research and conducting real empirical or scientific research, not research in the sense of Googling something for 20 minutes, right? Having a really deep and rich understanding of the field or the background or the profession or something, and then they are also good at communicating that, because one of the problems we see too is people who are really good at doing research or conducting scientific research aren't always the best communicators. So sometimes in a team you might have someone who's the communicator of that team's research or their ideas or the work they've been doing, because it is a really important skill set. It's a really unique skill set, and if it's done well, if it's done effectively, it can have a really profound impact. So I think it is also worthwhile talking about the value of thought leaders and the skill set that goes alongside of that, and understanding the positive impact that people can make if it's done well, if it's done ethically and professionally, versus the potentially really negative or destructive impact it can have when it's done without the proper, evidence, research in the background, or without the right intentions, because sometimes people are thought leaders for, fraudulent companies, or for scams or things like that. So looking at the intentions behind it, what the ideas are within those kind of thoughts or ideas that people are leading on, and where that goes and where that leads people.
Completely. I think one of the topics that's probably very easy to look at in terms of real thought leadership versus people just, I guess, sharing their experiences and sharing what they may have read somewhere is mental health. You know, if you go on LinkedIn, you probably can't avoid a mental health post somewhere, and that's, you know, probably the place where there's the least amount of those kind of posts. But if you go to kind of more, I guess, fun social media like TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, although I haven't been on Facebook for a very long time, so I'm not sure what's happening there. But you get lots and lots of these experiences, and they're kind of almost presented in a way it's like, do this and it will fix you, or this is why you have been feeling like this, when, you know, those topics are super duper complex. So I wanted to look at some examples, if we can think of any, and kind of break it down and see what works and what doesn't in those circumstances.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting trend too that I have mixed feelings about in some ways, because in the last 10 or 20 years, there's been a profound shift in the way people talk about mental health and awareness of mental health and people's willingness to share their experiences of their mental health or to talk about that. So I think from that sense, that's a really positive change, but there is a very dark and actually destructive side of that, in that now that a lot of people are talking about mental health, there's a certain segment of influencers who are capitalizing on that for their own personal brand or influencer clout, even though they're not experts. So I think it's really good that you are able to talk about mental health with a community of people who understand you, or with, you know, a certain section of people who share similar issues or challenges or learn from other people's experience. But the big problem is people who want to be influencers or thought leaders based only on their own experience, because psychology and mental health is extremely complex, and that's why you have a lot of qualifications for, you know, clinical psychologists or counselors, or for people who are giving advice not just based on their own experience, but from decades or even longer of research, of understanding how these really complex issues manifest and how they can actually be dealt with or treated or managed in real world settings based on people's actual experience that doesn't necessarily transfer between one person or another, or one group or another. So I want to really kind of draw attention to that, is you should not be diagnosing yourself online. Like, Dr. Google was bad enough, but Dr. TikTok can be much worse if you have, a 30-second video listing symptoms, and then people go, oh yeah, I have that because, you know, I haven't gone to a clinical psychologist who we've gone through a complex diagnostic scientific process. We've just watched a 30-minute video and said, oh yeah, that's me. And the risk in that is people not getting actual treatment. Like, it's great to have an awareness of mental health problems or, you know, personality disorders or things like that. But it's also important to do that with proper clinical expert advice, because otherwise you can do things that are not just unhelpful, but really counterproductive.
And one example that we spoke about when we were kind of planning this was the satanic panic in the US, and I think it was the 90s. Was it the 90s? Am I remembering that correctly? Well, I don't remember it. But even clinicians get it wrong, right? Like, there was a whole bunch of people practicing repressed memory therapy, and they were actually implanting memories. And then after lots of research into how effective it is and whether you can influence someone and implant memories, the scientific field decided that you absolutely shouldn't be doing this kind of therapy. It's not safe, and you can implant memory. If the people that are doing the research and have got the education are still getting it wrong sometimes, then, oh my goodness, like, speaking about these subjects, you know, with a level of like, you should be doing this, is very scary for just a normal person, at least in my opinion.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I'm a psychologist. I've got an undergraduate degree in psychology. I've got a master's research methods in psychology. I've written 6 books on psychology. I'm not qualified to diagnose people, right? Like, I can't diagnose someone's anxiety disorder or something like that because I'm a workplace psychologist. So even I don't have the qualifications to be doing that specifically. So I think it's good to kind of understand that level of expertise that's required to really be practicing effectively in that field. And again, like you said, even psychology is a developing science. So things like, you know, that happened in the 90s about false memories being implanted, then we learn all sorts of stuff about how the brain works, because we realize that, you know, memory isn't something that's absolutely hard-coded forever. Our memories can change every time we think about something, remember something, consider it, have an emotional reaction to it, in the present or in the past. We can, you know, change and modify those memories a bit based on how we're accessing them and kind of how we're feeling at the time. So memory is dynamic. It can change. It's not perfect. That's just one example of, you know, something something that at the time even some psychologists were getting wrong, and their practice was negatively affected. Their patients were impacted by that. So that's a good example. And then the same is true of if we're talking about now and people diagnosing themselves with disorders or things like that online, because it's not necessarily the best information. And one of the things that I've noticed about, especially with stress and anxiety, is people are talking about it all the time on social media. And I think that can be counterproductive in some ways, because if your feed is completely all the time inundated with stuff about stress, anxiety, it's reminding you of it every 5 seconds, every 10 seconds. And sometimes the way to deal with that is not to be constantly thinking about it. It's to deal with different coping strategies, different coping mechanisms to deal with stress and anxiety, because there's all sorts of things that are effective, but being reminded of it by influencers constantly on your timeline every 5 seconds is not always a productive way to deal with anxiety.
Absolutely. Incredibly dangerous. I think one of the other aspects here is obviously those more toxic thought leaders, or in some cases they are influencers, I would say, because they're not really thought leaders under our new definitions. Those people have a huge sphere of influence, and especially when we're kind of like in a almost like we've got fake news, we've got influencers like trying to put their own opinions down your throat, you've got thought leaders who are not really thought leaders. Like, how can anyone guard against that stuff?
Yeah, I think one of the things is to not take too much advice from your social media feeds and to really go to the expert sources of information. Because one of the other things that happens, we've talked about this before, is the hot takes that people do. They're trying to be influencers, or they're trying to be thought leaders, and they're not really providing any new information or context. They're just reacting to the news stories, right? There might as well be in the question time audience or something, complaining about something, reacting to something, giving their own opinion and saying, oh yeah, I've been talking about this for years or decades, when really they've been telling their friends in the pub about it for 10 years. But they're not really adding anything meaningful to the conversation. They're not necessarily experts or critics who have a relevant opinion in the field. They're just putting their opinions out in reaction to things. So I think the other thing is to go straight to the sources of evidence, go straight to the sources of information, and figure out who is the best, most reliable, most trustworthy source, and use that as a method of getting information. If it's about psychology, that might be mental health charities, or it might be your counselor or therapist, or someone who's a real expert in that field and not online. But the same is true of any business advice too, right? Like, people give out marketing advice all the time on social media. It's not necessarily the best. It might just be what they do. Whereas if you're going to Emma and Ruta, who have tons of experience, who have done this really extensively, and also have a long history of success and being effective in marketing, then that's someone you want to listen to. But you can demonstrate that. And one of the ways I've seen both of you do this is talk about things like metrics and outcomes. And instead of comparing just generally some of one's opinions, you're saying, okay, what's our target? What's our objective? What are we trying to achieve? And how are we measuring that? And that's really useful in any field, but especially in marketing, right?
Yeah, because that was the thing, Ruta, I was going to say, because we're kind of like we're not the bad guys as marketing, because we kind of encourage everybody. If we work with organizations, we would encourage everybody within their organization to kind of showcase their expertise through their social media, but that we would only say to showcase your expertise. And I think that's the point. Like, you need to be an expert, otherwise don't do it. Stick to what you know. And I guess, yeah, Ruta, how do you feel about that in terms of like because that's the advice we always give people.
I'm conflicted, because on the one hand, we know that kind of influencer or thought leader type of people in a company can really help that company grow, right? So we've seen this done over and over again. Founders that are experts in their fields, regardless of how we're I guess defining expert at this point, but people that are experts in their field and then they build a product, they can build some really amazing companies off the back of that. And there's lots of examples of that, both in B2B and B2C. But there's a lot of people also trying to now do that after they have built a product, which they may not be an expert in, and then just kind of trying to bake that on top of what they're doing. And again, done well, there's nothing wrong with that, because you could go out and educate yourself, and you'll probably, improve your product because of it, because you'll be using new evidence, new viewpoints, I guess. But also, if you're just talking about your take without any other evidence to provide why your take is better, then you're in a weird place. As marketers, at least M&I, whenever we're talking about, our product is better at this than doing this, we always try to add a little bit of proof why that is. So, even if using our own systems metrics to say, before someone did this, they were like this, and then after we could see in the data they was like this, something like that, that's valuable and it's useful, and it's kind of not just us saying stuff for the sake of saying it, but there is a lot of saying shit to just say shit, and that's the hard bit, right?
Yeah, and I think actually you've raised a really good point there about kind of the intention and what's behind it, but then also just saying shit to say shit, because I've seen that too, and I've seen a couple people over the years who have not a lot of purpose, but get attention for one thing, and then they kind of keep going in that direction. It's not necessarily a business or a marketing plan or anything. It's just they're going in the direction of what's getting likes and followers. But it's not really productive, it's not really useful, and that can take you down a really dangerous road when you're following that, because you'll end up saying things that, may be less true or less important or less, worth saying, but you're just doing it because you're growing your following and you think, okay, the following and the likes in themselves are worthwhile, even if they don't lead to anything else or there's no purpose behind them. So I can definitely see people getting derailed on that route too, trying to do something that initially is constructive or positive, but just following something because that's what gets them the most attention. And like a lot of these social media feeds are really structured to encourage the most controversial, the most emotional response, the most kind of intense feelings that people have in reaction to something. So sometimes we talk about social media influencing people's opinions, but I think thought leaders can go down that path too, and it can be quite destructive and sometimes not intentional, because you think the feedback you're getting is positive because it's bigger or more substantial, but it doesn't have a purpose and there's nothing behind it. It can really derail there.
I believe in Dark Social, you talk about the different kind of personalities on social media. When you look at, for example, LinkedIn, and you compare these like founder influencers versus just normal people, I guess, who don't post very much, do you kind of see those personalities creeping up in your feed and you're like, oh, I think we're leaning here or we're leaning there?
Yeah, without trying to diagnose anyone online, definitely you see some tendencies and some very specific patterns of behavior that you think, okay, this is interesting. But then one of the things is trying to find people who you can rein in. And that's why working in teams and productive teams is really important, because it's really good to have expert advice from a team, right? So even an influential thought leader or leader of an organization, it's good to have some marketing advice to say, okay, don't go down this road, don't take this road, here's what you need to focus on, or here's the direction you need to take. Because, sometimes you've got people who are just naturally like attention, like the spotlight, sometimes a bit too much. And sometimes on their own, without guidance or oversight, they can really go off the rails. But if you've got a team of people that they trust, they take advice from, they respect their advice, you can really channel someone effectively to doing really good work as a thought leader within certain constraints and guidelines and with some help. So I think, that's one way to look at it. But also understanding who is good at that, because not everyone is. Some people just really struggle to do that, really struggle to communicate online, whether it's in text or video, and may not be the natural person to do that. So I think looking at sometimes people's natural strengths, as well as a bit of understanding what their dark side is and how to kind of channel and focus that appropriately, can be really useful when you're looking at, marketing and a company leader as a thought leader.
Yeah, absolutely. So with all of this in mind, how can we make sure people are actually positive influences on social? Obviously, Ian, you talked about there making sure you take advice from teams. Is there anything else you'd suggest people try and do to be positive?
Yeah, I think being really honest with both yourself and other people about what you're trying to do and accomplish. Because if you've got two different objectives, one of which you're telling people online, and the second objective is something that you only tell a couple people in your company, they're two completely different objectives that don't necessarily match, then you've got a problem. And that's a serious ethical dilemma. It might be a problem of honesty. But if those two don't match, then that's fundamentally a problem, right? And you can see that sometimes that's very transparent, is what people are saying versus what they're actually doing or selling are two completely different things. And I think it's not worth doing that, because people often, not always, but often find out relatively quickly. People can spot that. So I think being honest about what you're doing both to yourself and to your audience is really important, and being able to discuss that. So if you can't discuss the intentions behind what you're doing, then there's probably a problem there. The other thing is making sure there's a real impact and making sure that that comes from the real world before social media. Like, it is possible to build up a brand on social media and then try and turn that into a product, but I think doing it the other way is much better. So if you're communicating from already having a great product or a great idea or a great piece of research or something that's tried, tested, evaluated, and then you're taking it to a wider audience to communicate it or even get feedback on it, like that can be a really useful approach to social media too, is if you're piloting or beta testing something and you want to get some feedback, get some people to test it out and get people's honest opinions. Sometimes strangers online will give you a very honest opinion, so it's useful for that too. But but making sure you're really honest about what you're doing is important.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that I used to work in the charity sector, and we used to talk about this a lot, which is called, white knight syndrome, where someone kind of comes along and they're like, I need to save the world. And they're kind of doing it, and it's like really with this sort of like weird intention, and maybe they don't necessarily realize they're doing it. I think another part of that is, yes, be honest online, but also just be honest with yourself. What is it that what are you trying to achieve? If it is this kind of white knight syndrome, I need to save the planet, I need to even though you might have the best intentions, I think you've got to ask yourself really what's at the root cause of that.
Yeah, and intentions and ambitions aren't necessarily enough to be sharing your opinion, right? Like, speak to something that you've actually done. If you have cured a deadly disease, or you've made a serious difference in your community, or you've raised a whole bunch of money and you've done that effectively, then talk about how you've done it and talk about what you learned, how other people can replicate your success, how people can learn from that. But the other way doesn't really work. Don't talk about how great you are or what you want to be doing in the future online and then hope the rest comes from it, because that's completely reversed. So exactly that white knight syndrome is, actually get the work done first and then talk about it. Or if you're doing it kind of in tandem, then figure out a way that it's actually representing stuff that's happening in the real world. It's not just something kind of made up or your imaginary profile that you're trying to create and trying to manifest it and hoping that all of a sudden you do become a billionaire just because you've talked about it online.
Well, we see it happening with influencers all the time. You gotta look rich to get rich is the usual game that gets played.
Yeah, and I think that's something to be aware of too, because I definitely have a few people that I follow that promote themselves as having a business, but they're spending constantly a lot more money than they're ever making, and they don't really have a real business. What they have is a marketing machine, and the money might have come from parents or kind of family wealth or whatever, and so they're using it to create a profile of a business without having a real viable business, which I mean psychologically I think that's absolutely fascinating. But it's one of the things to be aware of when you see someone being supposedly really successful or effective online, is not everyone is necessarily has a viable business, is making money, is doing anything with the influence they have, and it's not always real. So you have to be careful about learning lessons from people who are doing that versus looking at actual real successes in business.
I mean, whole entire businesses do that, right? Like FTX, WeWork, Casper, they were all failing businesses in terms of their actual business model and making a profit at the end of the day, regardless of how they were choosing to spend their money for growth or whatever it was. But whole entire businesses do it, and whole entire businesses do it to investors to get more money for their businesses, which is just a whole other mindfuck on its own. Hopefully the recession will kind of trim some of that out. But yeah, it's not just on an individual. Yeah, it's not just on an individual level. You can do that on a whole business level, which is huge, right? It's impacting maybe hundreds and thousands of people at that point.
Yeah, exactly. And I've seen people do that too. Have a great marketing plan, have a great idea, have a great prototype, do all of the marketing, and then realize much later down the road that actually building the product is way more difficult and way more expensive and sometimes not even viable. So you don't want to have that, all of the marketing and stuff come first and then figure out what it's like to build the product or how to build a business. You want to make sure all of them are realistic, because otherwise you run into a whole bunch of trouble.
I guess the takeaway here is take it with a pinch of salt. Everything you see online.
Yeah, definitely be critical.
Says the psychologist and the marketers. We're like, don't do it.
Yeah, be very skeptical.
We've spoken about thought leaders and what they used to be and how they used to come about, and we've kind of made a distinction that a lot of today's thought leaders are more like influencers. But let's say you are in that space where you've got some influence, you've got some following, but you would really actually want to become more of a thought leader in the traditional sense, how could you go about doing that?
Talking about real world impact, making a difference, figuring out what you're doing well, and then speaking from that instead of going in reverse. But then figuring out how to scale that impact if that's really what you want to do, or you figured out your business is really successful, effective. And you see this sometimes with small businesses that do what they do really, really well locally, but then need to figure out how to do it on a bigger level, like a regional or a national level. So focus on what you've done really well, and then what can make a meaningful impact and what people will connect with on a bigger level. But make sure you have that really solid foundation to build from. And then scaling that up is sometimes really challenging too. So you have to have all of that other business and operational expertise to make sure that you can do what you're doing effectively, if it's a business, at a greater level with bigger impact. If it's talking about ideas, again, making sure the process of your communications are exactly what you want to be known for and who you want to be, right? Because it is easier to do this unethically. It's more effective in the short term, but it often falls apart in the longer term. So making sure you've got a real strategy about how you're communicating, what the intention is of that, and doing it honestly. So if you're doing it at a wider scale with more people, then it's, you can maintain the same thing that was successful for you initially. I think that's the main thing.
Put in the work. That's it. When I used to work in the charity sector, the people who made the biggest impact were generally the people who didn't want to shout about it. But the stories are still worth telling. It's always that. Do the work first, then worry about your kind of like social profile, your how you can influence people afterwards.
And then also being clear about metrics and success metrics too, because I think the easiest metrics of success are, likes, shares, number of follows. Those aren't necessarily the best success metrics for any business or any product or anything. I know a lot more useful work often happens in DMs, right? And it might not be people who comment, but then they're conversations you have after, and they're conversations you have separately, individually, privately, and that's fine. So chasing likes is not always the best or the most effective way to do it. And the people who are liking your posts might not necessarily be the people who are going to buy your product or participate in your work or work with you or whatever you're trying to achieve. So being really clear about targets, metrics, and objectives, and then basing your social media activity from that instead of the other way around.
Yeah, we would always be saying to people like, yes, social media is amazing. It's a vehicle for getting more traffic to your website. All of those good things that are actually more valuable than like the likes and the shares and the reach, all that stuff.
Ian hit on a really good point there, which is picking a target audience. So it's easy to write a post. It's even somewhat easy to write a post that will elicit a response if you're dramatic enough or you have a hot take on something. But as the writer, you can never guarantee that the people that are reading and commenting and engaging are the right audience that you might want to engage with for your business. So being really specific about what your audience cares about and making sure that you are speaking to your audience instead of just speaking to people in general. And then you can, of course, cross-check that with who likes the post, who shares them, is it the right kind of job titles, and what you're going for as a business is really important, because that's when things can get lost sometimes. Or I've had someone come to me and say like, oh, this guy's amazing on social media, and he's a salesperson for a product, and on his social media he just had a popular post about something that's completely different, and I'm like, oh yeah, no, that doesn't count. I will say he's amazing when I see him posting about what he does and it getting lots of attraction, not posting about some random recruitment story probably. So yeah, be really specific and be really careful with who the target audience is.
Yeah, that's such a good point too, because you can both get either a lot of criticism or a lot of positive feedback on social media, and it can be completely irrelevant to your customer, client base, audience, whoever it is. So being really clear on who your target audience is or target demographic is or who your customer is so important, because that's who you should be trying to find and speak to and also listen to. And a lot of the other stuff is just noise.
Yeah, you're just screaming into the void otherwise, I always think.
Yeah.
You're just like, nobody's listening.
And Ian, you're writing a new book. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I just actually had a second edition out of, I'll hold it up, Myths of Social Media. So the first edition of this actually came out in March 2020, which that was a very bad time to release a train station and airport book. But this is really specific to marketing on social media. So I co-authored this with Michelle Carville, who's a brilliant expert marketer. And we had a really good collaboration on this, talking about, the psychology and what's going on and the mental process and stuff going on behind social media, as well as specifically how it's relevant to marketing. marketing. And we broke it down in a whole bunch of kind of marketing myth busting type chapters to look at exactly that kind of stuff, like things like how you segment, understand, and listen to your audience, what kind of metrics you should be using, should CEOs be thought leaders, should they be on social media or not, if they are, how they should approach it. So it was fun because I like the myth busting approach to look at some of the kind of common misconceptions about social media or marketing or business, and then kind of break them down, because some of them there's a grain of truth to them and some of them not so much. So it's a really kind of practical and applied approach to social media of what you should know, what you should be looking for, how you should be using it, and it's a very kind of practical business perspective on it.
Is there anything that you found in your myth busting that maybe surprised you or that just sticks out in your mind?
One of the things I sort of found surprising, but looking at kind of the history of information and disinformation and partisanship and kind of stuff being split, people being split, is there's a much longer and deeper history of that than I really realized. Like, I knew stuff like different, media catering to different political or religious groups had been happening for a long time. But it's interesting to see these common psychological phenomena that have been going on forever. As long as there's been communication or media or, anything like that, there's been these problems. It's just on different platforms and accelerated in different ways. I'm not even sure if it's necessarily worse. It's more kind of pronounced in some on some platforms and for some people and with some groups. But it's not a new problem, which I think is quite comforting, in the fact that we kind of understand what it is and why it happens and what the psychological process are going on behind it. How we deal with it, how we manage it is a constant evolving and complex issue, but I do find it comforting that at least it's not new, it's not fundamentally different. People haven't fundamentally changed in the last decade. We're just, using different communication platforms for slightly different purposes.
Blame the invention of the printing press for fake
news. It all went wrong there, yeah. You can go back farther, and the invention of the alphabet was apparently empowering the wrong people to say the wrong things.
Cave paintings, hieroglyphics, it's all lies.
I
know, yeah, misinformation on cave paintings.
Yeah.
Thank you everyone for listening in to this episode of Blame It on Marketing. We want to thank you, Ian, for being here. And his second edition of The Myths of Social Media is out now. So please go check it out. It sounds like an amazing read for anyone who is in marketing and who's interested in social media and the psychology of it. We hope to have you on another episode. Thank you again, and we'll be back soon.